Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man is one of those castings when originally announced, a lot of people just scratched their head and they were saying, I don't know if this will work. Fast forward to Iron Man 1, and then end his saga with Avengers Endgame, and he's gonna go down in history as one of the best portrayals of a comic book character ever. But it wasn't all easy for him, so let's get to that. I still remember when Robert Downey Jr. was cast as Iron Man, being on web forums at the time and seeing a lot of outrage and confusion. For once, Robert Downey Jr. had a criminal background, alcohol abuse and all this, and many people, at the time at least, the hardcore fans knew, but the casuals did not know that Iron Man was pretty much Robert Downey Jr. if you really look at that story of his redemption arc. So it was a weird time, but ultimately when it came to Iron Man 1, everybody was won over. That film won over audiences, and then it went on to spawn the rest of the MCU. But when it came to Robert Downey Jr. taking on that role and playing the character from 2008 all the way to 2019, he says that it wasn't all easy. He said that specifically due to how the character was in the comics and where the character comes from and the parallel he ran with that character with the substance abuse and all that there was many times where he had to dig deep, remembering what it was like and how he would have reacted in a real world situation and then dealing with that, and that's sort of something that they wanted to play up in future films, but that ended up getting scrapped because there was no need to touch upon substance abuse or heavy drinking or anything like that when the story and the arc of the character became so much more. So they put a few little pieces in there, and he says that he was glad that this is how it ended up happening, but when it came to it, it was really difficult for him sometimes to go into that part of his life and remember when he's finally finding success. And I think most of you probably have had those moments where you think you moved on past something and something might remind you or trigger a memory that made you feel bad and you just don't feel good about it. Having to do that for literally months and months on end while shooting these films probably would not have been good. And we've seen as some actors just they can't handle it because that is a lot of pressure and you have to go into a different mentality and you have to change the way you approach things, and we've seen method actors do this and it completely changes them. And unfortunately, right around the same time that this was happening and Iron Man was being shot, we saw the passing of Heath Ledger, and ever since then we learned some of his issues that he had and how he was going into it. So it's just one of those things where you realize that ultimately Robert Downey Jr., he got lucky that they asked him and pulled back on all those problems and those aspects of Iron Man, because it would have been a difficult run if all you had to do was go back to that point in your life. I don't think I know a single person who likes to relive their worst moment ever over and over and over again. That's terrible.